Hello, my name is Hayden Michael, and welcome to the behind-the-scenes video essay detailing the work that went into the production of my animated short film, Ghost and Ghoul. It's been an exercise in cutting corners, managing expectations, compromise, and constant grueling work. I can't lie, when I first set out to create an animated short film by myself, I quite thoroughly underestimated the amount of work that it would take to see it completed, and there were moments where I thought I would be creating this video essay based on an unfinished project. My initial supposition that it would be possible for one person to create an animated short film in less than a year turned out to be correct, but only barely. I believe the only reason I was able to complete the film was due to focusing on my strengths and not being too ambitious with the overall scale of the project. If you're watching this, I would hope that you have already seen my animated short film, Ghost and Ghoul. If not, I would ask that you please do so before continuing to watch this video essay, as I will be discussing the inner workings and details of that project in a very matter-of-fact way which may serve to ruin the magic the piece holds on a first viewing. Please note that the short film is a major piece of this thesis project. I first began to work on Ghost and Ghoul in the July of 2019, but for now we will skip ahead to November of that same year, which is when I first began to write a script for the story. My original script was about 6 pages long, and told a story quite similar to the final project, albeit with 2 more acts after what ended up being the ending of the story. If you would like to read it, it will be available digitally. While writing, I kept my limitations in mind, as I would be producing the film entirely by myself. I did not include any spoken dialogue, which removed both the need to cast voice actors and the need to animate characters' mouths moving, something which I knew from experience was a lengthy and arduous process. I also tried to keep my use of complex objects to a minimum. I did not write any scenes with cars, weapons, animals, etc., because I knew that the time spent creating and animating these elements would detract from the time I was able to spend working on the rest of the project. However, there was originally a scene where a house burnt to the ground, and retrospectively, I am not surprised I ended up cutting that scene entirely. I wrote a story I hoped would be heartfelt and easy to understand. I decided to use undead monsters as my protagonists because the idea of taking a creature usually considered to be scary, dangerous, and other, and bringing them forward into a positive, relatable light was powerful to me. Also, these characters' inherent association with death drew a connection to a point of inspiration I have carried most of my life from the video game Majora's Mask, which dealt with dark themes such as death and loss in a way that captured my attention as a child and has stayed with me since then. In fact, I can also trace my pursuit of many skills and mediums back to this same game. I recall asking my father how the people who made the game had made the characters move around on screen, and he gave me a brief, simplified explanation of how 3D animation worked, and at that point I knew I wanted to be an animator. I've worked on quite a lot of animated projects through the years, but it was not until the spring of 2019 that I would take my first steps into animating in 3D. The idea for using a Ghost and Ghoul specifically came from a few places. Firstly, I love alliteration, so that was helpful, and I'm apparently not alone in the specific piece of alliteration, as the two creatures are quite frequently linked for this same reason. I had seen a comic by an artist on Tumblr named Lauren who had created a short story of a ghost and ghoul playing cards with a werewolf in a graveyard, which gave me the idea to have a ghost and ghoul become friends. Also, there was a wonderful animation I had seen online created by Louis Zong titled Ghost Choir, which featured simple sheet ghosts harmonizing and dancing together in a most delightfully charming way, and if you haven't seen it, I would highly encourage you to seek it out. Setting the story in and around a graveyard and linking its characters to death in this way was also, in part, a way of coping with a number of personal losses I have had in recent years, in particular my stepfather, who passed away in the July of 2019. Writing was, in the end, the easiest and fastest part of the entire process. I had a simple story to tell, and I didn't want to spend very long writing it because I knew if I held on to that stage too long, I would never get started on the animation, which I anticipated to be the hardest part. I finished my script, and it went through a brief revision process where my professor gave me notes on certain aspects of character development and continuity to ensure the project would make sense when finished. Animation was indeed the biggest part of this production, but there was another step of pre-production between that and writing which I underestimated to such an extent that it almost prevented the entire film from being finished. There's no good, all-encompassing title for the work that was done in this stage, but it breaks down to modeling, rigging, skinning, texturing, layout, and much more. But to summarize, all of these steps relate to actually creating the objects, characters, and environments that make up what you can see in the film, and then preparing those objects. I began to work on this process in early December of 2019, during my winter break from school, and I did not finish until a week before the spring semester of 2020 was set to begin, well over a month later. This is the reason why most of the story was cut from the final film. This month was spent building the characters and environments before I could even begin animation. Any scenes set out of this same environment would require just as much time to be realized before animations could begin on them as well. At the time this decision was made, however, I had already completed work on several of the characters that would be appearing in a later scene, so these completed characters had no place in the final film. Creating a unique character from scratch was a lengthy process. I started with my main protagonists, and knowing that my method of animation for Ghost was going to be different from the other characters, I decided that Ghoul would be first. My only modeling tool for this film was Blender, which is an open-source 3D animation program developed by the Blender Foundation. I created all the characters for this film using a similar method, which mostly consists of laying out a mesh of vertices and then tweaking the precise position of those points until I had formed a shape that I desired. This is, of course, an overly simplified description of the process, but it's the most accurate across the board. I tried to make my meshes consist of as low a number of polygons as possible, as this saves on the number of shapes my computer would need to keep track of while animating, something I knew would become an issue as scenes became more complex. Blender, and other 3D animation tools, has a function called subdivision surface, which is a non-permanent modifier that can be applied to anything you model and will increase the number of polygons in a model that when you are rendering or exporting your scene. This meant that I could create low-poly models for my characters that I would see during animation, and they would be increased to higher quality when I was finished with the scene. This is why a model in my animation files will appear jagged and angular, but when you see the same character in the finished film, they appear round and smooth. It is hard to describe the specific techniques I use to model characters and objects for use in animation, as it is more of an artistic process. But it's important to keep in mind when viewing this film that everything which appears on screen is something which I personally created and built from scratch. Everything from the character's individual fingers, to the blades of grass, to the iron gate surrounding the cemetery, to the moon itself is a 3D model which I created from scratch. In the end, it takes me about 19 or more hours to go from nothing to ready to animate for a visually distinct character of the quality I was hoping for this film. Except for Ghost, originally this would mean that I had to create 7 characters, so naturally I sought out a way to shorten the time required to create new characters. I was able to build a frame that represented a basic human, and then modify the proportions and facial features to create my 3 antagonists, and the characters that were cut from the film. This is why all of the human characters have very similar body types made of simple shapes, but it also cut down my creation time from 19 hours per character to 19 hours only once, technically 3 times because I had 3 distinct body types, followed by a further 5 hours for each modified character. Just modeling the characters isn't enough for them to be used in animation, however. After a character has been created and assigned textures, they need to be rigged for animation. For this project, this involved building an armature, which resembles something you may have seen in behind-the-scenes featurettes for stop-motion animated films, and then skinning the model to move with the bones of the armature. This process can either be incredibly simple or incredibly complex, depending on the number of fine details in your model and how precise the movements you are trying to achieve are. For my purposes, I only needed to create gross movements of limbs, with only a few specific hand positions being occasionally used throughout the project. However, I still wanted to be able to convey a wide array of emotions through my very simple techniques. And to do this, I looked to an old DVD that has been in my family's possession since before I was born. That sounds rather ominous, but it's just an old disc. On the bonus features for Wallace and Gromit, the first 3 adventures, there were excerpts from a behind-the-scenes look at The Wrong Trousers, where creator Nick Park discussed how the team endeavored to get emotion out of Gromit, a dog who has no mouth and cannot talk. Park says that they realized Gromit would be incredibly emotive just through his eyes and brow. And it's true, if you've ever seen a Wallace and Gromit feature, you know Gromit has no trouble conveying his feelings. Knowing I would want the eyes of my characters to be the main powerhouse of their emotive ability, I was able to reuse a technique I had developed as an honors addendum in my 3D animation class in the spring of 2019, where I had eyes that were set to look at a point I could control, and eyelids that were given their own armature and could rotate and blink in a number of positions. It may not be anatomically correct in any sense, but it certainly gave me the results I was hoping for, especially as it was helped along by the way I decided to light the characters. I developed the techniques I used to rig controls and animate expressions for characters in July when I created a 3D version of my mascot character, the Wry Wizard, for use in various projects. I experimented with ways to show color and textures, as well as ways to show expressions and create movement. Ultimately, I settled on a technique similar to that used in Majora's Mask to give its characters emotion. This technique involves creating different mouth shapes and facial expressions as 2-dimensional images, and then projecting them onto the 3D surface of the character's face. The different expressions can be swapped out to create the impression of more complex facial animation. Originally, my plan was to have the environments and main cast of characters animated in 3D, with Ghost being drawn over top as a 2-dimensional character. To facilitate this, I created a reference version of Ghost based on my original concept art, which I intended to use as a stand-in. The original plan influenced many other parts of this project, some of which I will discuss later. However, with regards to the character designs, I decided to have my character rendered with a stylized lighting system, which is usually referred to as cell shading or toon shading, in reference to traditional animation, in which animation was done on a clear sheet, called a cell, which is layered above a painted background. The use of bright colors with a clear, sharp distinction between light and shadow has come to be known as cell shading. I hope to emulate the traditional appearance of characters layered above a painting by having my cell-shaded characters layered over a more realistically lit environment. Blender has built-in functions to allow for cell shading, but these are not usable within the rendering engine I had elected to use for this project. Typically, Blender uses a system called cycles to render an image. This process takes small pieces of the image and systematically calculates the way that light enters the scene and bounces off the different surfaces and enters the camera in a reasonable approximation of how a camera works in real life. This technique is known as ray tracing, and the results can look incredible, but each image that is rendered in this way can take several minutes to create, with time increasing drastically on a less powerful computer. Blender has an alternative rendering engine called Eevee, however, which utilizes similar technology to that found in video games to create an illusion of lighting and does so almost instantly, with the longest render times never taking more than 20 seconds per frame, and at the shortest taking less than 1. This was important as I knew even before my cuts to the story that I was planning a project of approximately 7 minutes in length. I'll discuss the rendering more later, but for now suffice it to say that Eevee was a better choice for me than Cycles. However, that left me with the problem that my desire to use cell shading was not accounted for in the rendering engine of my choice. I elected to build my own, rudimentary cell shading system using the tools provided by Blender. I fed the data from naturally shaded light through several conversions until I was able to force it to have a clear, sharp distinction between light and shadow. A limitation of my system is that it doesn't account for light sources of different colors, so a light with a red hue will affect my characters in the same way that a light with a blue hue does. However, I decided to accept this limitation as I did not believe that it would detract from the overall film. That's certainly not all that went into the creation of the characters for this film, but it does cover all the major brushstrokes. However, with just characters, I was still not ready to start animating my film.